Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of I Like to Read with me, your host, Rachel Polanski. Today, I am joined by the esteemed cultural critic and author, Anne Elizabeth Moore. Hey, Anne, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
So you've written quite a few books. Today, we're going to be mostly discussing Gentrifier, your newest memoir, but do you want to give the listeners and viewers a little bit more of an introduction to your background, and then we'll dive into your latest work?
Sure. I mean, I'm a nonfiction writer and comics creator, and I've worked mostly in somewhere between the realms of art and investigative reporting and women's issues for my entire career. And so working on a memoir was kind of a weird
yeah, I bet. Like,
and yet I ended up writing basically about those things in my memoir. So it's not too far of a leap, but.
Right. That was my first question too, is, how do you balance all these different genres in your work? Because of course, it is a memoir, but it's also a coming of age story for the young girls who live in your neighborhood. It's also, there's a sociocultural exploration of race and the larger bureaucratic issues surrounding the city of Detroit and other cities. There's a portrait of a woman such as yourself living with an autoimmune disease, and being very open and transparent on the page. So how did you sort of, balance all of that? And how did you decide sort of what to explore when? Because I think it all came together really beautifully.
Well, the process of writing that book was completely different than anything I'd ever done before, even though many of the themes can be found in everything that I do. And particularly, when I started writing Gentrifier, I had recently written a book on a comics critic, Julie Doucet, who just won the Grand Prix at Angoulême. Woo! And before that, I'd written an entire book on autoimmune disease. So some of this stuff, I have ways that I sort of think about it and I put it on the page. And so then it became a little bit easier to combine this otherwise very complicated set of concerns, each of which would probably have freaked me out if I'd,
But they each could have been their own exploration piece. And
yeah, exactly. But the process of writing the book was really about trying to transcribe my memories as clearly as possible in these very short little bits. And I can explain
Yeah, because my next question too is, sort of what was the decision to structure it around these little vignettes and these sort of, rather than a more traditional.
Because it's not a flowing memoir. There's no sense of linear.
Which I personally love. I think in vignettes too, I love little, little snapshots of life. And I really like that structure. But how did that come about naturally in your writing, or was that sort of predetermined?
I guess, it's, as a comics editor, it becomes something that's actually kind of the way that you move panels around. It's just very natural to the process. But for this project, it was the only way to combine that array of things that you were just asking me about and have them feel balanced, but also have them play off and refer to each other in ways that I wouldn't have been able to achieve in a more traditional, multi-paragraph format with chapters that, described things happening in time. So it, and then also, of course, it just ended up being a way of really pinpointing everything to the funniest potential bit. Because of course, the other thing about the book is that it's mostly funny. Yes. There's parts that are definitely not funny, but it's an attempt to kind of combine my interest in jokes with my interest in really thinking through large scale cultural events. So I don't know. I tried it. No, I
think that's the comic angle is really interesting too. I didn't even think about that, where it's you're jumping from panel to panel, and it is that sort of it's linear, but you're choosing what's the most important, and that little bit of comedy too, because it's I wouldn't call it a funny book necessarily, but it's also it is there. Plenty of things that could have gone super dramatic and dark and been a little bit more of like a thriller horror novel, especially with when you're trying to locate the former resident of your house. That could have almost been like that's a detective thriller plot in itself. But I think the levity that you're able to bring to it, and I've read a couple of your other works as well. And so even when you're not talking about yourself too, I think that's what's unique about you, is you're able to find this levity without being like, I'm a comedian and this is haha fun, haha, which, no shade. I've read plenty of memoirs by comedians and they're fantastic. But, as a cultural critic foremost, that comes across.
Yeah. Although I did get my start in comedy. And so
you did?
Yeah. My
stand-up
first
comedy?
real gig was writing for The Onion.
Oh,
so I was around all those guys.
That makes sense now that reading
this. Who were like
vignettes read like they could be Onion. Some of them were like too crazy to be the stuff that you went through, which we'll talk about. I mean, it reads like an Onion piece at times because it's like, how can you just be this battered down again and again? It's like you're doing all you can do as a human being and you still can't win.
Yeah, right. Which is the undercurrent of every single Onion story. Like we're all screwed.
Right. I mean, and it's like pointing out the obvious and in just like a very matter of fact way. It's just like, you know what? I haven't even visited the Onion in a while, but I think one of the first times that I saw one of their headlines, I was like, is this real? Is this? And that's what's so good about that. Because if you don't really know what it is, you're like, this very well could be real. But speaking of, framing the novel, another decision, or the novel, sorry, memoir, another decision that you made was to continue revisiting A Room of One's Own and using that as sort of a framework. So can you talk a little bit more about that decision and also sort of just women's, larger question, but like how women have their own agency in literature and how that sort of, how you decided to touch on that and your own connection to Virginia Woolf and all that fun stuff?
Yeah, I mean, Virginia Woolf, as tense as our relationship can be, she is someone who's had profound influence on me in a very direct way. And so for about 5 or 6 years, really, I was concentrating almost exclusively on tracking the incomes and the opportunities available to female and non-binary comics creators around the world. And all of the questions that we were thinking through and asking really did come from that same Virginia Woolf piece, A Room of One's Own. And I didn't even remember that when I sat down to write Gentrifier. I was just like, oh, everybody made jokes about it. When I moved into the house in Detroit, everybody was like, oh, A Room of One's Own, ha, ha, ha. And so when I decided to incorporate quotes from that text into Gentrifier, sort of as a way of like cohering it around a narrative that wasn't set in a timeline, I was surprised by how totally emotional of an experience it was for me to be like taking on this writer that actually does matter to me a lot. Even though, she was writing 100 years ago, she had a very different way of looking at the world of cultural criticism. She was really, she was definitely interested in issues of gender. She was not terribly interested in issues of sexuality, even if she was actually queer, bisexual. She didn't care much about race at all. And so it was
I think many people did 100 years ago and they didn't
totally true. But I also generally, when I try to, when I want to give someone that platform, I do want them to be like thorough, and so it was a complicated thing, but she just brought so much, I think, to the discussion of what women writers need in the world, both historically and in that book, that it just felt like the right thing.
Yeah, no, I liked how, you were interacting with them as opposed to sort of just putting like an epigraph or something and just an opening quote. It would really, the way you interacted with it without like super, without going super meta too, which I think might have taken away if you had like gone, it was the right amount of layers. Shifting a little bit more to like the concept of the American dream and home ownership. Do you think that the idea of the American dream, especially with the idea of home ownership, do you think that's having a negative impact on future generations? Even if people are able to achieve it, is it even worth it, from your own experience and from other research that you've done? And does this help kind of normalize the nomadic concept that I think a lot more, the lack of being rooted that I think a lot more people in the younger generations are finding?
Yeah. And, I moved every 8 months for my entire life until I moved into this house. And so like, I really was
there. Also, are you still in Detroit, by the way, or are you still in that house?
I'm not. No, I live in New York State now.
Right. So you ended up leaving. So right, you're in New York City now. Okay. And do you rent or do you own?
Well, so now I own.
Okay.
And there's a whole dramatic story about how I came to own this house, because you can't like there's not an undramatic way of.
That's what I'm even saying is I feel like, my parents bought the house I grew up in the early 90s. I was born in 94. So I think they bought it in like 90 or 91. And I'm pretty sure from what I remember, it was not like super complicated. I mean, they had to go through financing and a mortgage and all that, but it was like, you see the house, you need a realtor, you do some negotiating. Now it's like, we have to put in $400,000 above asking. And we also have to waive any contingency. It's like, what? Even just like,
but even before the pandemic, it was like, you were, especially in Detroit, you were unlikely to get a bank mortgage. So you had to save up money. And then you had to like gear your entire life around like building a credit score so you'd be eligible to even think about it.
Like, is that what the young people in Detroit, is that sort of what they grow up being like, we want to own houses? Like, do they still have that mentality in them, or are they just super disillusioned by it?
I mean, it's a little bit of a different thing in Detroit. And of course, like in terms of young people, I only know the Bengali community that I lived among. I mean, not only, but mostly.
The young people that you interacted with, because I haven't with any young people.
And so the presumption is that those homes will sort of stay in the family.
Okay.
Whereas I think throughout the rest of Detroit, there's much more of a sense of like, there's housing turnover all the time. People can kind of move into and fix up houses, and that's great. But, in terms of like, buying a house that is functional and that you can move into and that there's hot water and a working bathroom, that's not always the case in Detroit. And it's less and less the case anywhere else in the US. And it's definitely like out of reach financially for most people around the country. And that's bananas to me. I mean, if we're talking about the American dream, like, then what are we working for? Like, Are we just giving that up? Because working to work is the worst idea ever. It's horrible. Just saving up money because
you might need
you'll
to
probably get
amputated. Yeah. Instead, and a lot of people have to choose between that, or they do, end up getting sick and not, maybe they have a house because they purchased it a long time ago and they were able to, and then they get sick and now the insurance system is so messed up that they're not. I mean, it's just. That's a whole other, and I know you touch a little bit on the bureaucracy, but it's like, you have to have like the time and the resiliency, even just like to file a claim. It's like, it's not easy. And that's for like the most basic things. So it's like, if you can you talk a little bit more like about your findings on bureaucracy specifically, like as they relate to, owning a house in Detroit and sort of the loopholes that you had to go through, especially, even acknowledging your privilege, you are, presenting as a white woman and that you were in the minority in a minority neighborhood. So how did that like impact your bureaucracy?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of navigating bureaucracy, it was obviously as easy for me as it could have been for anybody. I mean, I'm white, female presenting, identify as woman, and therefore I, am seen to be available to the men who are running all these things. And therefore they want to help me. Yeah. Which is all like this other layer of it.
Yeah.
But so it was easier for me to navigate that stuff than it was for like my neighbors who had a language barrier and then sometimes sort of gender role barriers and financial barriers. But I mean, it's incredibly difficult to get anything done in Detroit, especially when you're talking about home ownership stuff. So it's changed a little bit in recent years, but I've been looking more into the situation of the previous owner of my house. And I mean, you would not believe what that house alone has gone through and how
that part was that was crazy. That was a more like thriller piece where it was like just trying to track down the last person who lived there. And it's like, I know people want to go off the grid for various reasons, but her story was it was like, did she exist? Like, was she even a person? Like, and it's like, did something happen that she needed? It just all these mysteries that you're forced to fill in yourself, because ultimately, like, that's, I think what's unique about houses is like, they're going to be continued to pass down. And whether it's just the land and you redo it, there's always like the energy of the people who've lived there.
Yeah.
That's
except
weird.
In home ownership, you're also supposed to be able to track it in paperwork that the city is supposed to hold on to. And they didn't. And they don't even care.
And that's not unique, right? That happens for a lot of people, right?
It's what?
That's not like super unique, right? That's the situation that's happened to other people in Detroit, right? Or is that just?
Yeah, it's common in Detroit. It's
not in the rest of
elsewhere in the country. I mean, yeah. So there were only like, I don't know, the limited staffing even disallowed people from actually doing their jobs. And so, like tracking down any piece of information there is just, it's a crapshoot. And most people don't want to give it to you because then once you get it, there are even more questions and they don't want to answer them. So,
because then they realize that it's like someone didn't do their job along the way, and it's just exposing that even further for them too. So
and then you're gonna want to know about it because probably you have some financial investment in the question, and they don't want to deal with it because they're paid like, $9 an hour.
And I don't blame them, but also it's like, again, it's like the trickle down issue. It's like they need to be paid better, and then it just gets into a whole messy thing, and it gets exhausting to think about that. Like, how did you sort of try to separate, because it is ultimately a really heavy subject. It can be exhausting. I was sort of exhausted for you just dealing, your roof collapsed, lots of unexpected financial strains, really ultimately, how did you cope with all that? Like, how did you deal? Because I don't think you also weren't writing until after this happened. So it's not like you were using that as a therapeutic form. How did you cope?
Yeah, for sure. And I was writing other stuff.
Right. But you were writing this book. So
yeah. But I didn't handle it very well. I mean, there are very few resources, and it just, it's not a city that was set up to have a strong social fabric for me. And so it was really, really tricky. And I'm pretty straightforward in the book about like, I had the worst depression of my life, or at least one of them. And the only solution at some point was like, oh, I have to get out of here.
Yeah.
And when it was like, okay, well, I have to get out of here, then, normally the book would kind of, start upswinging from there, and everything would get more comprehensible and everything would be, but in this book, it was like, I realized, I have to get out of here. And then everything kind of got significantly worse.
Right. Once you try to leave, it was almost, it's almost like an abusive relationship where it's like, when you try to leave, that's the most dangerous.
That's when I pull you back, I literally pull you back in. And so, when I, was sort of going through all of the legal stuff toward the end of the book that just really looked like it was just going to keep me attached to the city for the rest of my life until I died in this house that I would never be able to actually own or sell or get rid of. I have never experienced a depression like that. That was amazing.
That's daunting. I mean, I don't know how it's like you think, I mean, that's part of the whole, the basic tagline of your book is sort of what happens when you're given this free piece of land in a city you've never been to, but then you go there and it's not the best things in life are not free. That's as they say. And so kind of a deeper question, but how do you grapple with wanting what's best for your own self, especially when you've put in the work, but that it's still somehow causing a ripple effect on others? Like, how do you sort of balance that, like wanting your own personal growth while understanding that it may be at the detriment of others, both, on a tangible and sort of a larger level?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really invested in this idea of trying to do no harm and digging through my own behavior in such a thorough way that I'm uprooting. Like covering the fashion industry for a long time and thinking about the garment trade and really only trying to buy clothes from people that it may be at some point even personally know and literally just want to financially support as much as possible. That gives you kind of a sense of like how deep I'm willing to go in order to refrain from damaging other people, women in particular, no matter who they are, no matter where they are in the world. And so, when we get to these things, like realizing that the garment trade is really damaging a lot of women around the world, or that our, living situation has probably caused trauma to at least one other woman in the past, maybe more.
Yeah, but there's got to be at least, maybe not a woman, but there's got to be other people at least who were.
Yeah. My own thing is to try to undo it. Track that person down, to have a conversation.
You tried very valiantly.
Yeah, and figure out what can be done from here. So it's it's a process, but also like luckily it's also kind of my job. Like it's kind of like I lucked into this career where like I'm allowed to follow my curiosities and my instincts, and that's kind of where my work tends to lead. So
yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you. And then also, how do you sort of, when you're thinking about how hard it is for one individual to enact change, whether it's, in something that you're working on or something that you're experiencing in your personal life, like how do you sort of separate the idea that like, I'm just one person, like I can't enact change, with the fact that like you are making these changes, but you might not see like the results long-term, like you might feel them more internally. Like, how does that all play out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I think about that is actually in my relationship with young people, particularly in Gentrifier, and the young women that that were my neighbors. But in my previous work, I lived in Cambodia for a number of years, and I was working with young Cambodian women, and I had sort of the same feedback from them, and you don't necessarily know, if you're an adult and you're hanging around with people who are younger than you, you don't necessarily see the way that you impact them, both as a kind of role model, but also as a person that like is deliberately trying to teach certain things until, every once in a while, maybe somebody will say something or they'll behave in a way that you recognize from your own, body movements. Right. And those are the moments that I always realize, like, oh, okay, it's not actually about saying the right thing at the right time in the right way that's going to appeal to other people. It's actually just about trying to live a life that makes sense to people and that is truly focused on trying to be a good person and welcoming and loving of others.
And so did you do, was there some sort of great moment in your life where you had that radical realization, or is it something that you've been working on your entire life? Because that's like a really beautiful philosophy. And I think that to be so open about it is really special too.
Well, thank you.
More women, like, especially in terms of, wanting to inspire younger voices for something beyond just like your own personal gains, or like, I want to mentor you so you become part of my company. Like, you really care about how these young women evolve and are, and you recognize that you're potentially only in their life for a short amount of time and they may not even remember you, but you want to have this like lasting impact on them, which I think that, hopefully for the Bengali women, that the young women, that you've made a difference at, exposing them to queerness, like that's fantastic. We don't get that very often. So I think it's really special.
Well, it's also easy because they've had such a profound effect on me. It's easy to want to reciprocate that, but yeah, it is kind of something that I've been thinking about my whole life. You don't articulate it in the same way when you're 25 as you do when you're in your 50s, but
you don't, even when you're 15, you don't articulate things the same way you do when you're 25. I mean,
yeah, totally not. Yeah.
Or even yesterday, you'd be like, how did I articulate that? No. Yeah. Okay, so a little lighter now, but I want to talk about cats and your relationship to cats. I think also, again, there's this sort of larger image that we have of like cats as these feral, like outdoor creatures that we associate with lower class neighborhoods. And if there's like a bunch of feral cats, then it must be overrun. But for you, and for me too, my cat's over here sleeping and actually quiet for once. How have they helped and impacted you throughout your life? And is there anything, that you picked up on, especially with your cats? And, you talk a little about like the cat colony that's forming in your neighborhood, but sort of like how cats have helped you, and also, how you may have, I don't know, losing my train of thought. Sorry, just like how they have played a role in your literature as well, I guess is more, what I'm.
Yeah. I mean, for many, many years, they were always sort of a visual joke, especially when I was working on comics. And so they would just appear and then there would be like a cat. And it was always like a friend's cat, and it was kind of recognizable to all of our friends. But I did have this cat for 23 years that lived with me and is literally the longest human relationship I've ever had.
That's crazy. When I learned that he was 23, I'm like, I hope my cat lives to be that long. That's crazy.
Oh, it was the best thing that you can imagine. I mean, he was annoying. He did not like it when my breath would get on him. And so if I was sleeping, he would come over and he would cover my nose with his paw so that he could sleep. Precious. Meanwhile, I'm being strangled by my cat, but he didn't.
Right, you can't even breathe.
Yeah. So it was really like, so we had this contentious relationship, but he was, he had his own personality that I lived with for almost a quarter of a century. And learning how to love a being that doesn't have any language to communicate with you and can really only like hiss and eat and poop to, tell you what it needs, was like a really big thing, I think. And it, I think that's how cat owners generally feel, but trying to make that clear on the page was new for me in a memoir. And I feel like, I've gotten a lot of positive response about it, but I've also gotten a lot of people who are like, you used your relationship with your cat to turn this book around. And I kind of get that too, of like, well, I mean, I did, but also like,
it was like part of your life. It's not like
happened. Yeah. So, I don't know. They're just great. My cat now is named Captain America and she's really, very cute.
That's such a cute name too. I love that.
Yeah, I adore her, but she doesn't have the same personality as
that's what I'm learning is like so my cat's almost 6, and I got him right after a cat that I'd adopted before him had passed away of a neurodegenerative disease. And that was my first time owning a cat. So I adopted him and he was super quiet. And I just kind of thought, oh, he'll take time to warm up. And then within a month, like he was really sick and passed away. And then I ended up getting my cat now named Willoughby. And he is just like the love of my life, but he is a little brat sometimes. And I almost feel like some of his behaviors, I like recognize in myself and I'm like, oh, I raised you. So it's also this interesting like dynamic, like of, they are our babies, but also ultimately like they don't really grow up to, because when you were saying it's like, navigating a relationship with someone who just poops and pees and wants food. It's like, that's a baby, but babies grow up. It's like, they never grow up.
Right.
So you're
never
growing
gonna
up
grow
with
up.
them. So you're like almost projecting. It's like, I've already been through so much with him. And it's like, it's a little scrapbook of your, like the memories that we have with these creatures too, I think is really special in the way that they travel. I mean, 23 years, that is really insane. Cause what's like 20 years is like the normal expectancy relatively.
Oh, I think it's closer to 16.
Wow. So
yeah. But I also live in a social environment where all my friends know, like we all know each other's animals, and we all, like you get on the phone with your friend's cat Miso and you say
right, that's
hi.
us. It's like, oh, that's Willoughby screaming in the background. Yep. Or when I would call someone I don't know, they might think it's a baby because he sounds like a baby. He's very vocal. I'm like, nope, that's just him. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about your experience working with Catapult and what it was like to work with a small publisher. I really like Catapult. I actually took an online class with them a couple of years ago, and I constantly love the writing that they're supporting. So did they reach out to you? Did you reach out to them? Like, how can you talk a little bit more about the behind the scenes publishing process? And also, I don't know, is this your first book with them, or have you worked with them?
It was, yeah.
So what it's like to work with a small indie press, as well as if you want to talk a bit about your experience publishing your other books as well, and how this one may have been different or similar.
I mean, Catapult is, in terms of independent presses, is actually, because it's part of this conglomerate. So it actually was one of the larger independent presses that I've worked with in the past, besides something like Houghton Mifflin, which actually was independent when I was working with them. And working with independent publishers has been sort of a primary aspect of my career for its entirety. And so that part was great. And also their focus on sort of women writers and particularly like marginalized women's voices was really comfortable for me. And I really enjoyed, the process of kind of putting the book out in that milieu. I have an agent who's amazing, and this was our first book together. And really, the book went out on submission, I think, within a couple of months of the first lockdown.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah. So there were questions at the time about whether or not anyone would ever publish a book again. I mean,
right.
Everyone thought that we probably would, but, nobody knew what was happening, and it was all very, very strange. And so, really, Catapult was interested, and I worked with Megha Majumdar over there, and she was great. And but there was also this thing of like, okay, let's not examine this. Let's just do it, because this is, we don't know what's going to happen in the future.
Right. And
enough of the pieces work that this will be good. And it was a scary process, because the tour kept getting canceled, and then we'd add an event, and then we'd had to switch the event. And publishing right now is just a really weird beast. And
it kind of was before the pandemic anyways, right? But I think the pandemic really made things weird. Because the idea of like, physical books, like I personally, like I don't have the space for physical books. Like I read so much that I get most of my books from the library, like digitally. And I was against a Kindle for so long. And now I'm like, I don't know what I would do without it, just because it's like, I literally otherwise I would just have, I don't think even one room would be enough for all the books I read. And I just like, also financially, it's a lot of money to continue to buy all those books. But I do think there is something about, the art of the physical book, and then the idea of the bookstore, and also a cover. I mean, there's a lot that's lost when you're going digitally. And so I know the idea of the physical book though, and like less people are reading too, and just attention spans. And that's a whole other thing. But so they kind of like let you run with it. Like they didn't really want to mess too much with the book, or how much like editing did they do from your initial go?
I mean, it's a weird book, but it was a weird book in the first place. Like it, I did edit it, and I did cull it, and it became better through the editing process. But it was always these weird little vignettes that were kind of jokes that resulted in this sort of investigative / horror novel about, a weird.
Who has lived in your house before, and do they even exist?
Yeah. And so that was kind of all there. So luckily we were able to just like finesse that together and make it work. And, so my editor and my agent were both really helpful in that process. And then of course, also I work with a core of writers that's really helpful for everything that I do. I have a couple good writers groups and friends in the industry. And so, by the time I send something to, for publication, it's really been through a couple of different major editorial overhauls, just in terms of my social network. So that's just the way that I work. If everybody could work that way, they probably wouldn't, because it's really a mess, but
it works for you.
I like the editorial process. So I like to get feedback and hear what people think and imagine ways that it could be funnier and stuff like that.
Totally. I think, and that's what's so cool about the mesh of different genres too, is you can tell that there was, a lot of thought put into it. And clearly, you have a great support system that has helped you both, get to the place where you're at in this book and then get to the, after it. Are you still in touch? Are you still in touch with people from the neighborhood? So I know you mentioned there was kind of a crazy story with Now You're Owning in New York. If you want to update us, what's happened since the book ended?
Yeah, well, my neighbor girls, one of them graduated from high school and is sort of thinking about her next plans, and the other is getting ready to, and they both have crushes. And that I occasionally hear about.
To have a crush when you're 17.
I know, it's so great. By the time that I was ready to buy this house, which it took a couple of years to sort of.
And are you in New York, upstate New York, or where are you?
I am. Yeah, I'm in the Catskills.
I was gonna say I don't know your financial situation, but if you bought a house in the city, wow, you must be doing really in.
Yeah, no, definitely not. I definitely. Well, so what happened was that I was so well versed in how houses work that I knew exactly what to look for, and I and what found the person who was going to be able to help me do it. And so I got a private mortgage, which means that I didn't have to go to a bank. I just really one-on-one made an agreement with the person who was selling me the house, and that financially is the only way that it worked out. And so it was great.
And didn't have to go through most of you had already gone through the bureaucracy for your other house. So it's almost like the universe was at least all right.
Yeah. Letting me off the hook in this one particular instance. Yeah. So I'm all about the private mortgage right now. If you can ever figure out a way to get a private mortgage, it's the best.
I don't even know. I just think about, because I'm 28, I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles. I was actually talking about the nomadic piece. I've lived here almost 4 years in this apartment, but prior to living in this apartment, at least once a year I moved, if not, twice a year, whether it was in Los Angeles. I lived in Burlington, Vermont before this. I went to college at University of Vermont, and I'm from the Boston area. So up until when I went to college, it was every year, maybe even less, because then it's the summers and all this. And so I am an introvert who loves my space and is super homebody focused. But then I think about long-term, I'm I don't really want to be 45 living in this 1-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles. I do eventually want to own a piece of property, but Los Angeles, any major city, it's that's not Detroit. It's the idea of just buying a house and just looking on Zillow. It's I don't think that, we talked about the American dream and whether that's attainable. I really don't know if I'm going to be able to buy a house, probably in a location that I don't love, perhaps. And that's what's also interesting is the idea of, having to be connected to a city, whether it's for work or your social life. It's becoming more and more of a luxury now to be able to afford to own a piece of property in a city. And I think people are creating these little niche communities now in places that had either, and what's sort of the difference between that and gentrification? Is there a difference between whether it's developing land that, no one was there, so you're technically not displacing anybody and starting over, or maybe you're just sort of shuffling the people living there, but it's not so much gentrification. How do we exist? And that's, I don't know if you have an answer, but it's how do we exist in this world where people, who are in their 30s and 20s, like they really don't know if they're ever going to be able to buy houses. And if they do, it's like knowing that it might be in the middle of nowhere or like in a community or in a city that's like, 10 years from now, like, I don't know, like people are now moving to Vegas and Arizona, but like even 10 years ago, those were known as sort of like trashier states. And now that they're like, purple states a little bit more, it's just like, how do, I think that that's something that for the first time, like my parents, my mom owns a house, my dad owns a condo, like their parents owned houses. I see people my age buying houses, but the only people I see my age buying houses are like in North Carolina or like places where it's more affordable. So like, do you think we're ever really going to reach this bubble? Do you think the bubble is going to burst, I guess? Or is it just going to keep burst?
I mean, something has to change in terms of the housing market because it is not survivable for anyone except for like the 4 rich real estate developers who are making all of the money off of it.
Right.
But the difference, I mean, I'm pretty clear in the book that I'm not, the gentrification becomes this like catch-all term for larger questions that are actually, I think, significantly more important. And those are questions about displacement and questions also about how do we live ethically in a place, especially in the US, where like every bit of land is unceded territory. I mean, there's not, is there a way to like even imagine living ethically in this country? And those are the bigger questions that I don't necessarily have an answer to, but that I am interested in asking and trying to figure out how that might be possible. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like creating an environment that is ethical, I think it's even a slightly different question than creating a space to live in that feels safe. And I think right now in the US, more people need to be thinking about doing that, or we need to be thinking about that on behalf of more people, because most of the country is just, in unsafe environments, whether that's COVID related or domestic violence related or
water, like
building,
basic things you expect as like a human being.
Yeah. And so all of these questions really are, bigger, I think, than what would appear to be what we're talking about when we talk about gentrification, but are no less like big and complicated and kind of harrowing and difficult to have any sort of meeting of the minds about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Do you feel like, in a perfect world, what is your perfect living situation? Do you think you've achieved it? Do you think that it's something that can ever be achieved? Or do you think it's something that, people, because like I said, I've been here almost 4 years. I really don't want to move, but it's like, we do need a bigger 2-bedroom. Like now the idea of moving is like daunting. So like, do you think that there's ever going to be that sort of perfect medium of like finding your perfect space? Or do you think that we're always going to be wanting something better or bigger, or conversely, are other outside factors going to make it impossible to like long-term stay in your perfect living situation?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of finding a place that seems to work and then really digging in and making it work for you and for your neighbors. And so I actually think this thing of like, having to buy a house in a sort of nowhere town in North Carolina, I think that's actually a really great opportunity, because that allows you to just ask questions of yourself that you would never otherwise come across, and make commitments to people that you don't have any previous connection to. And in some ways, I kind of feel like I did that a little bit. I did move to a town that has fewer than 500 people.
Wow.
8 independent bookstores, no police force.
Is amazing.
And the largest oxycodone manufacturing facility in the world. And it's
less than 500 people?
Less than 500 people.
And
it's really very, it's in a red county. And I'm on village government, and it's really, really, really intense. But this is my opportunity to like involve myself in a situation that's just really distinct from anything I ever grew up with or thought about or experienced, and to find what's great about it. And I feel like I'm starting to do that, or that I've done that. So actually, I am really happy here. And I do feel like it's very close to being ideal, if not actually ideal.
And that's what I was saying to you, is like, I don't even know if the ideal situation exists, because there's always going to be something that it's like, oh, I wish this was smaller so I could do this, or I wish this was bigger, so I could do that. But I love that you've finally been able to sort of find a place that feels like home and feels comfortable for you.
Yeah, it's weird. It's not like I'm just getting comfortable saying that, because it's never happened before in my entire life where I felt safe and comfortable and like I could figure out a way to get my basic needs out, which, I guess that's why it was a memoir and not a purely investigative report. But like, it's weird. Weird,
to hear yourself say these things out loud, that you've been like probably wanting, everything that you've been working for sort of led to this moment. And that's true with anything in life, but you put in a lot of work, especially yourself, to really like make this happen. It's not like you just had like an inheritance dropped in your lap or something like that. Like you really worked hard to make this happen.
Yeah, for sure. And friends who have had inheritances drop in their laps have the luxury of being a little bit more like, I'm just going to build an addition, or I'm going to or I want a bigger house.
How dare you complaining about your piping or whatever? But it's like, okay, but you have a working bathroom at least, like stuff where it's like their perspectives are a little bit, because like, as I mentioned, I'm a little bit younger. So the people I know who are buying houses, and like, I'm pretty sure there's got to be some family, because I'm just like, how do you have enough money saved? You haven't lived long enough. And like the expenses of having to like go through life anyway, whatever. That's a whole other thing. But before we wrap up, I'd love to know, what are you working on now? If there's anything that you can share with us that's in the coming future.
Sure. Well, so there is a second memoir that is about my father's autoimmune disease, and also a little bit about this town and its sort of tendencies toward white supremacy, and it thinks through connections between chronic illness and chronic racism.
Yeah, that's is that already done, or is that something you're working on right now?
It's something I'm working on. And at the same time, I am working on my first novel, which is about a prolific murderess.
That sounds amazing. Well, I am definitely looking forward. I'm looking forward to both of those. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, and hope my listeners and the readers, listeners, watchers, everyone out there, if you haven't read Gentrifier already, it is a wonderful, weird in all the best ways, unique memoir and piece of literature. And I think all your books are very special, but this one, because you put a little bit more of your personal self in it, to be able to chat with you about that and have you share some more stuff was really special. So thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it.
And we will link your site below where everyone can buy your books. And until next time, everyone, stay reading. Bye.